Hello, and welcome to the landmark 75th episode of KRAD COVID Readings, Part 2. I am continuing my reading of Horn and Ivory, the novella from the Star Trek Gateways book What Lay Beyond, which was served as the epilogue to the novel Demons of Air and Darkness, which was the fourth in the post-finale Deep Space Nine series that picked up where What You Leave Behind left off. We continue with Kira's Odyssey in Bajor's past. Chapter 5. Look, Torna's not going to bite your head off if you take the complaint to him. Are you sure? The merchant looked dubious. More than that, he looked scared to death. I've heard about how he drove off the Lerrit army by breathing fire into their camp and setting them alight. Kira tried not to laugh, but she did at least keep an encouraging smile on her face. I can assure you that his days of breathing fire are long in the past. Just go to him and tell him that you object to the inspections. I can't guarantee that he'll do what you ask, but he will listen. Just give him a chance. The dubiousness did not leave the merchant's face. If you say so, I say so. He should be back in the next day or two, and I'll make sure you get to see him, all right? Fine. Thank you, ma'am. Nodding, Kira excused herself from the merchant, leaving his quarters, and going out onto the deck of the docked merchant trawler. It never failed to amuse her, this fear people had of Torna, mainly because she knew his bluster was worse than his bite. She also had to wonder, though, if this was what people thought of her after the Cardassian withdrawal. Did people fear that she would breathe fire? Was that why she had been sent to Deep Space Nine? After all, she'd been assigned as first officer and Bajoran liaison before the discovery of the wormhole turned the station into a major port of call. She'd never had any illusions that had been done to get her out of the way of the provisional government, who found her intemperate ways to be too much for them to handle, at least nearby, so they sent her into orbit. Natlar had all but done the same to Torna. The disruptive influence he could have in the council chambers, as evidenced by the way he all but took over the meeting shortly after the Lerrit army's final retreat, was probably seen by the prefect as an impediment to actually getting anything done. Kira walked down the gangplank of the merchant's ship to the marina and took a deep breath of the sea air. She'd lost track of how long she'd been serving as Torna's adjutant at the Natlar port, but she'd been enjoying it immensely, particularly now that the weather was warmer, the sun was shining, the Corvale ocean was a clear green, and a lovely breeze was pretty much her constant companion every time she walked outside. She hadn't spent much time near the sea prior to this, and when she did, it was during her days in the Resistance. She had other things on her mind then. She nodded to the assorted dock workers who passed her by, then whirled around when someone cried, "Look!" The Perikia Peninsula jutted out into the Corvale Ocean along the southern end of the coast of the continent. Any ship that came down the coastline from the west would have to, in essence, come around a corner, and therefore would not come into sight from the marina until it was almost ready to dock. Right now, one of the largest and most impressive ships that could be found on the planet was coming into view around that bend. It stood at 10 meters above the surface of the ocean, with the green and black flag of entry whipping in the breeze from the mast. Kira peered more closely and noticed that there was a second flag under it. The flag of the Perikian Republic. Interesting, Kira thought. It wasn't there when we left. The ship was Admiral Inna's flagship, the Hyas, returning from a day early from their investigation of the reports of pirate activity. Several people on the marina stopped what they were doing to see the flagship approach the dock. As it settled into port, a cheer started to break out, which spread all the way around the marina. Kira found herself joining in the cheer. She wondered how much of it was general goodwill toward Admiral Inna's fleet and how much was the new presence of the Perikian flag. Within half an hour, Inna and Torna had extricated themselves from the admiring crowd. Kira noted that they had been chatting amiably as they approached the gangplank, before they were set upon by the admirers. Quite a switch, she thought, from all the sniping they'd been doing. The Admiral went off to consult with the captains of the other fleet ships in dock, and Torna walked with Kira back toward their office in the rear of the marina. "So what happened?" Kira asked. "We found the pirates and took care of them in fairly short order. They didn't have anything to match Morent's cannon." Smiling, Kira said, "Morent? That's new." "I beg your pardon," Torna said a little indignantly. As they approached the office, nodding to the sergeant at the desk, Kira said, "Wasn't that long ago that the only way you referred to her was as the Admiral or that damned woman?" To Kira's surprise, Torna actually blushed, his skin turning the color of his hair and beard. "I suppose so. But she showed me something on this trip that I didn't expect. She was efficient, yet merciful with the pirates. She was very effective in questioning the pirate leader without being unnecessarily brutal. And she agreed to fly the Perikian flag. I was going to ask you about that." They entered Torna's tiny office. The general sat behind his rickety wooden desk, which was cluttered with assorted pieces of paper that required his attention. Torna ignored them and instead poured himself a drink from the small bar that sat under the window looking out onto the mainland. Torna had specifically requested a north-facing office so he could look out on, in his words, the republic that I fought for, not the ocean that is controlled by somebody else. He offered Kira a drink, which she declined. They liked their drinks a little less smooth in the old days, she had thought after the first drink she had shared with Torna, and she made it a point to avoid the stuff when possible. It took surprisingly little argument, he said as he sat down. I pointed out that her fleet was there at the invitation of the Perikian government, and was there to protect Perikian interests, so it made sense that they should fly our colors. Not that she gave in completely, of course. Let me guess, you wanted to fly the Perikian flag on top. Kira had spoke with a modicum of facetiousness, but Torna leaned forward and said gravely, These are our waters, Ashla. We must never forget that. I haven't, she said with equal seriousness. She also noticed that she'd said the Perikian flag, not our flag. Perhaps a minor point, but even though she had fought for the Republic's independence, even though she now worked for Torna, she still couldn't bring herself to think of this as home. She knew that this was the right place for her to be, but in the back of her mind, the constant feeling was that this was not her new home, that she was only visiting. It made no sense to Kira on the face of it, and she wasn't sure what to think of these feelings. Deciding not to dwell on it, she leaned back in her chair. So what did the pirate leader say when Inna questioned her so efficiently? Taking a sip of his drink, Torna said, Actually, the most interesting intelligence we received wasn't from the pirates, but from their slaves. The most recent conscriptions they picked up were refugees from a disaster in the fire caves. Kira blinked. What? Apparently the entrance to the fire caves collapsed and completely destroyed Ivory. Ivory was a city on another peninsula west of Perikia, but on the same continent. It, too, had a thriving port. Torna snorted as he continued. Some of the slaves claimed there was some kind of blue fire when the caves collapsed, but I don't put much stock in that. Kostamogen imprisoned, the Pa-Wraiths banished in the fire caves, Shabren's fifth prophecy, the emissary going to the fire caves to stop the Pa-Wraiths from being freed. Kira knew exactly what had happened, remembering her experience channeling the prophets during the Reckoning, and now knew precisely when she was. Some 30,000 years before she was born, the prophets banished the Pa-Wraiths to the caves, sealing them in there forever. Only their leader, Kostamogen, was imprisoned elsewhere, on a site that would one day be the city of Bahala. The others remained in the fire caves until Winadami and Skrain Dukat attempted to free them only a few months ago, subjective time. Only the sacrifice of the emissary, Benjamin Sisko, had thwarted the scheme. Or, rather, will thwart it. I hate time travel. We need new tenses. Until now, though, it never occurred to Kira that the prophet's actions at the cave might have had harmful consequences to the people near the site. We've got to help those people. There may be... Sit down, Ashla, Torna said, which was when Kira realized that she'd stood up. As she sat back down, Torna continued. This happened over 2 weeks ago. There's very little we can do. Right, of course. There's no instant communication here. Kira nodded in acknowledgement. However, this does mean we're going to see a significant increase in traffic in the port. Without Ivory, we're the only viable port on the southern part of the continent. Kira nodded. Traffic's going to increase. That's an understatement. Torna broke into a grin. Yet another parallel, she thought. The discovery of the wormhole transformed Deep Space Nine from a minor outpost to a major port of call. This wasn't quite on the same scale as that, but Kira did remember one important thing from those early days on DS9. Torna continued speaking. We'll need to work on expanding the marina to accommodate more ships. Maybe now Marta won't close her tavern down the way she's been threatening to. For that matter, we probably need a new inn. Plus, we'll need more ships from entry. Or we'll have to start building some of our own. Frowning, Torna said, What for? I mean, we'll need more people for the dock patrol, obviously. The number of drunken louts on the docks will increase dramatically, but I don't think we'll need... We're going to need more ships to hold off the pirates and the Lerrit Navy. Torna snorted again. The Lerrit Navy is hardly worth giving the title. Don't be so sure of that. We just got another report from Molokai. Molokai was one of the spies that the Perikian Free Army had observing the goings-on in Lerrit. In fact, the PFA had many such operatives, more than even Torna or Kira knew definitively about. He says that they've employed shipbuilders from KRAD province to completely rebuild their navy from scratch. Within the year, they may well be a legitimate naval power, or at least legitimate enough for us to worry about. And with this change in the geography, they're going to be more interested in taking us back, not less. Torna frowned. Isn't KRAD part of the Bajora? Kira nodded. He shook his head. Wonderful. We didn't join their little theocracy, so they helped the Lerrit behind our back. You can't blame them for taking on a lucrative contract like that, Kira said, trying not to examine how much that sounded like Quark. I can damn well blame them for anything I want. Torna stood up and drained his drink. Damn it all! I was actually enjoying the good news. I'm sorry, but... Torna waved her off. No, that's all right. That's why I keep you around, Ashla. You have a knack for dragging me back to reality when I need it most. He turned to stare at the view from his window. There is a great deal of work that will need to be done. Kira got up and walked to Torna. And we better get up off our butts and do it, shouldn't we? Definitely. Torna smiled. What else did Molokai have to report? Nothing different from his last few. The official word is that the queen is dying, but she keeps showing up at official functions. She hardly ever says anything, but she's there and smiling a lot. Molokai seems to think that Prince Avtra is doing all the real work. Shaking his head, Torna said, That woman will never die. You know, she swore that she would live long enough to see the peninsula brought back under her rule. She's probably the one who contracted the Geradians to build her a navy so she could fulfill that promise. I dare say she's clinging to life solely for that reason. Maybe. She hesitated. I'm glad you and the Admiral are getting along better. Yes, well, her tiresome insistence on giving those silly prophets of hers all the credit for her work aside, she's quite a brilliant tactician. They both sat back down in their seats after Torna poured herself another drink. She was able to deal with those pirates with a minimum of fuss. You should have seen, he went on at some length, describing how she stopped the pirates and her ideas for curtailing some of their activities in the future. Kira smiled and nodded, but naval battles were not an area of great interest to her. Her tactical interests for vehicular combat were of that sort tended to be more three-dimensional. She was just glad that Torna and Inna were getting along. She had a feeling that that would be vital in the long run. Chapter 6. The worst thing about the dungeon was the smell. True, Kira had spent most of her formative years living in the caves of Dakur Hills and other less than hospitable places. But even though she had been roughing it by the standards of her culture, it was still a world that had replicators, directed energy weapons, faster-than-light travel, near-instant communication over interstellar distances, and other luxuries that Kira had always taken for granted. Such a world did not include a dungeon that smelled of dried blood, infected wounds, and the feces of assorted vermin. She looked over at Torna, sitting in the corner of the cell. The wound on his left arm was growing worse. If it wasn't treated soon, the gangrene would probably kill him. Just hope our capture did some good, she thought. Kira had no idea how long the war with Lerrit had been going on. At this point, she couldn't even say for sure how long it had taken the retreating troops to bring Kira and Torna to Lerrit's capital city and the dungeon where they'd been languishing. On the one hand, in a world where communication and transportation was so slow, the pace of life was much slower than Kira was used to. On the other, it seemed like the rebellion had only just ended before this new war with Lerrit had begun. Kira had been fearing this very thing since the collapse of the fire caves meant more business for the Natlar port. The port had indeed thrived, giving the Perikian economy the shot in the arm it so desperately needed in order to start truly building itself into a legitimate power in the region, instead of an insignificant nation lucky enough to have a nice piece of real estate. What she had not expected was the sheer strength of the Lerrit army. The same army that Kira had helped repel had doubled its numbers and was much better armed. The navy was giving the entry ships a run for their money, and war had been declared on both Perikia and Entry, so there was fighting in Entry's territory both on land and sea. Still, they had won a major victory at Barland Field, driving the army completely out of the Makar province. All it had cost them was their best field general. The door to the dungeon opened and Kira winced. The place had no route of escape. Kira had spent the first 6 hours in the cell scouring every millimeter for just such a thing, and only one window, which was 15 meters above them. Just enough to provide a glimmer of light and hope for escape without any chance of that hope being fulfilled. A very small part of Kira admired the tactical psychology that went into the dungeon's design. The flickering torchlight from the hallway, however, was far brighter than the meager illumination provided by the faraway window, so it took several seconds for Kira's eyes to adjust. When they did, she was confronted with the guard who brought them their food and waste buckets, not replacing them nearly often enough to suit Kira. The guard wore the usual Lerrit uniform of gray and blue, with the addition of a shabby black cloak that probably served to keep the stink and filth of the dungeon off the guard's uniform. Standing next to him was a very short man dressed in a white jacket and white pants, both with the shiny gold fastenings, and a white cape that served the same function as the guard's cloak, and being white, was noticeably the worse for doing so. Kira recognized him, barely, from the coins that sometimes changed hands on the docks. This was Prince Sibba Avtra of Lerrit. "You look better on your coins, Your Highness," Kira said. The prince looked up at her. "Very droll." Then he glanced at the guard, who rewarded Kira's comment with a slap to the face. All Kira could think was, I have known some Cardassians in my time who would eat you for lunch. She gave the guard a contemptuous look in reply. Avtra, meanwhile, had moved on to Torna. You will rise in the presence of royalty, General. Torna looked up at Avtra with the one eye that wasn't swollen shut. As soon as I'm in the presence of some, I'll consider it. Again, Avtra gave the guard a glance. Since Torna was seated, the guard elected to kick the general in the stomach rather than bend over to slap him. After coughing for several seconds, Torna said, I'm disappointed. I was hoping that Her Royal Highness herself would come to gloat over our capture. It is, after all, the only true victory you have won in this war. The prince laughed heartily at that. Something amuses you? Torna asked the question with contempt, and with a few more coughs, diluting the effect of the former. My dear mother has been dead for some time, fool. Do you truly think she engineered this war, or our alliance with the Bajora? This time Kira felt like she'd been kicked in the stomach, though the guard had made no move toward her. The Bajora! No wonder they're so well armed. I can see by the look on your face that you appreciate the position you're in, General. With the Bajora behind us, we will destroy entry, squash you upstart rebels, and finally control the entire southern coast. He moved toward Torna, looking down on the general's dirty, bruised, swollen face with a sneer on his own clean visage. Now, I don't suppose you'll tell me what the troop movements are for your little band of spear carriers? If I thought you were worth wasting the spit, I'd spit on you right now, Torna said. His voice was more subdued than usual. Not surprising after the ordeal they'd been through, but the tone was abundantly clear. I assumed as much. Besides, I can't imagine that even your soldiers are stupid enough to retain the same battle plan after one of their generals had been captured. Still, I had to ask. And I wanted to see what the infamous General Torna in our dungeon for myself. You'll be publicly executed at dawn tomorrow. It was going to be yesterday, but the demand for tickets is simply outrageous, and we had to postpone so we could put in extra seating in the stadium. Kira wondered if that was the same stadium that had been unearthed in this region during the occupation. After the Cardassian withdrawal, Bajoran archaeologists had speculated that sporting events had been held there as long as 50,000 years prior to its rediscovery. That it was used for public executions was a fact of which Kira could happily have remained ignorant. Avtra finally turned back to Kira. As for this one, I suppose we should let Torna have one final night of companionship before we take her to the front lines. She'll make fine arrow fodder. With that, he turned and left, saying, Enough of this! I need to get the stink of the dungeon off my person. The guard closed the door, leaving Kira wishing she could get the stink of the prince off herself as easily. We have to get out of here, Torna said. Kira snorted. I'm open to suggestions. The only ones who have the free rein in and out of this cell are insects and rodents. Torna tried to stand up, but made the mistake of bracing himself with his left arm, and he collapsed to the floor. Kira moved to help him up, but he waved her off. I'm fine, just forgot about the damn wound. Stupid arm's gone numb. He staggered to his feet. Damn those foul Bajora! I hope those prophets of theirs strike them down with lightning. Prophets don't work like that, Kira thought, but refrained from saying it aloud. We have to... I'm fine, he added quickly, again brushing off Kira's offer of help. We have to get this intelligence back to the prefect and to Inna. If the queen is dead and the Bajora are helping... You were right, the fire cave's collapse definitely made our land more attractive. I don't think that matters as much as we thought. From the way that kid was talking, he's been wanting to start a war with us for years, but his mother's been holding him back. The collapse of the caves probably made it easier for him to justify it, but I'm willing to bet that we'd have had a war on our hands as soon as the queen died, no matter what. Torna nodded, and Kira could see him wincing in the dim light. He's more hurt than he'll admit, and the stubborn bastard won't let me help him. We've got to find some way out of here. If we can get back, tell them about this, we can change our strategy, try to hit the supply lines the Bajora are using. Sure, no problem. I'll tap my comm badge, order the runabout to lock in on our signal, and then we'll beam out of here. Then we can transmit a subspace message with our intel. That'll work. The door suddenly opened again. A guard, a different one, came in with 2 buckets. Then he closed the door. What the hell? The guards never closed the door. The guard dropped the buckets and then reached into his cloak and pulled out a set of keys. Come on, we haven't got much time. Take these. Who the hell are you? Torna asked. Oh, right, the password. The guard then uttered a phrase in Old High Bajoran that Kira only recognized 2 words of. Torna's eyes went wide. Molokai? In the very frightened flesh, yes. We thought you were dead. Well, I probably will be after this stunt, believe me. Don't know what I was thinking coming up with this ludicrous plan. They'll use my guts for building material, they will. Kira took the keys from Molokai. What happened to you? Well, nothing happened as such. I simply couldn't get any messages out. The moment her royal senility dropped dead, all hell broke loose. Truly, a spy can no longer make anything like an honest living in this environment. Can you get us? Torna said. Yes, I can get you out of here. Just give me a moment to collect myself. I've never been much for impersonations, and I had to pull off being one of those imbecile guards that the prince likes to employ, stomping around all day, bellowing at the top of their lungs so loud you can't think. He shuddered. No style at all, more's the pity. He reached into his cloak. In any case, here's a map that'll show you how to get out of here once I bring you to the surface, as well as a map that shows the supply lines the Bajor are using. Assuming you get home alive, that should be fairly useful. He put his hand on Torna's shoulder. Let me make something abundantly clear, General. It will not be easy to get home. It will involve going through a swamp and then across a mountain range. Deviate even slightly from the route I've mapped out, and you're guaranteed to be captured. And if we stay on the route, Kira asked, then you're just likely to be captured. I was afraid of that, Torna muttered. Kira looked at Torna and winced. He's not going to make it with his arm the shape it's in. He has to, damn it! Molokai said sharply in marked contrast to his more affable tone. Then he composed himself. Listen to me, and listen very carefully, because I'm only going to say this once. Years ago, I offered to help Perikia Romaro in whatever way was necessary. Not because I have any great love for that silly peninsula of yours, but because I want to see Lerrit great again. That isn't going to happen as long as these inbred mutants are in power. So you've been working to undermine them from within. Something like that, yes. It's been a bit of a chore, but I thought the end was near. Avdra is sterile, you see, so he can't produce any heirs. I had hopes that the Sibba dynasty would finally end its pathetic chokehold over my home. He sighed. This ridiculous alliance with the Bajora changes all that, of course. The Bajora know damn well that Prince Idiot is the last of his moronic line, and they plan to use this alliance to gain a toehold so they can take over once the crown imbecile dies. Molokai unsheathed the sword he had in a belt sheath. You'll need this more than I will. Kira took it and hefted it. It was a pretty standard design, average balance, nothing spectacular. But it beats being unarmed. She looked at Torna, who was now sweating rather more than was warranted by the temperature in the chilly, rank dungeon. You okay? No, Torna said honestly, but it doesn't matter. Molokai is right. We must return with this news, or everything we fought for will be lost. Chuckling, Molokai said, You're as much of a crazed zealot as I suspected, General. He held up a hand to cut off Kira's protest. I meant it as a compliment, my dear, believe me. I can say that as the craziest of crazed zealots. Now come, let us go over this map quickly before someone decides to check up on us. In over 33 years of life, Kira Nerys had been sure many times that she was going to die. Thus far, she'd been glad to have been wrong each time, but as she crouched in the half-meter of snow, sweat pouring from her brow even as she shivered uncontrollably, checking to see if anyone was coming up behind them, she was starting to wish she would die just so her present hell would end. First, they had spent 2 days trudging through a swamp. She had done what she could to keep Torna's arm from getting worse, but it was an uphill battle, and she was no medic. Plus, they had no food. Kira had many skills, but foraging had never been one of her best. They'd scavenged a few animals here and there, but most weren't any larger than a paluku. Resistance had been less than expected, but as Molokai had explained, the castle itself was not very well guarded. Support from the Bajora notwithstanding, in order to fight, in essence, a three-front war, on the ground against both Perikia and Entry, and on the sea against their combined navies, the prince had limited resources to keep an eye on things at home. Kira and her newly acquired sword had been able to take care of the few guards they had seen with little difficulty. Then they'd gotten to the mountains. From the humidity and high temperatures to snow and frigidity. From her old wound feeling just fine to her arms stiffening up from the cold. And now quite possibly coming down with pneumonia. If Julian were here, he'd give me a shot of something and I'd be fine. Of course, I'd have to listen to a lecture about not taking better care of myself. She shook her head. That part of her life was over now. She was here, and she had a duty to perform. The Prophet sent her here for a reason. Right. To die on a mountain with a blowhard general who got himself captured and was only able to escape imprisonment thanks to a spy. Makes perfect sense. Sighing, Kira satisfied herself that they still weren't being pursued, despite the 5 corpses they'd left behind in the castle and the obvious trail they had made through the swamp. She got up, hugged herself with her arms, wincing in pain from the wound, and, shivering all the way, went back to the small inlet where she'd left Torna. Damn it! She yelled when she saw that Torna had fallen asleep. He'd been fading in and out for quite some time. Kira's medical knowledge was limited, but even she knew that going into shock would be deadly. She slapped his face a few times. Torna! Torna, damn it! Antosa, wake up! He blinked a few times. Ashla? He said in as weak a voice as she'd ever heard him use. Yes, it's me, she said, plastering an encouraging smile to her face. hoping her teeth weren't chattering too obviously. We're still not being followed. We've only got a few more kilometers to go. Think you're up to it? He nodded. I think so. I just... Aye! Torna had started to rise, then collapsed back to the snow-covered ground. Sorry, he said through clenched teeth. Keep forgetting the arm doesn't really work. Let me take a look at it, Kira said, moving as if to pull back his cloak, stolen off one of the guards they'd killed on the way out. With his good arm, Torna grabbed Kira's wrist. No! He took a breath. I'm sorry, Ashla, but your fussing over it isn't going to change the fact that it feels like someone's driven a flaming hot poker through my shoulder. Once we get back home, it'll be too late then, Ashla. I need you to cut the damned thing off. Kira laughed derisively. Tosso, I'm not a surgeon. I don't have anything to staunch the bleeding or cauterize the wound with. If I cut off your arm now, you'll bleed to death. Not to mention that I'm shivering so much I'll probably cut off your head by mistake. And if you don't, I'll die from the infection. You yourself said that was a risk. A risk means the possibility of success. If I just hack your arm off right now with no alcohol, no bandages, no cauterizing agent. All right! You've made your point. Smiling grimly, Torna added, I suppose this means I'll just have to make it back to Perikia then. Kira just nodded and helped him to his feet. They trudged their way through the snow-covered region, climbing over outcroppings, under crevices, and through chest-high snowdrifts. She didn't know how long it was before she drained her water supply, or for that matter, when the blisters started breaking out all over her skin. She didn't have the wherewithal to check her tricorder to see how bad the radiation was. Every fiber of her being was focused on the overwhelming task of putting one foot in front of the other. How long ago was it that she had been trudging through the hot, arid wasteland of that theta-radiation-racked planet in the Delta Quadrant? Days? Months? Years? Now she was engaged in the same mindless task, staying focused solely on moving forward, ever forward, in the hopes of reaching her goal. Then it was to reach a gateway. Now it was to make it back to Perikia. Of course, the gateway took her to Perikia. Is there some kind of symbolism here? Or maybe it's just nonsense. Maybe all of this is. Maybe I'm just here because it's where the gateway sent me. There's no purpose, no road the prophets have put me on. I'm just here because some portal built by a bunch of aliens hundreds of thousands of years ago happened to show up when I needed it to get off a planet. She closed her eyes and then opened them. Focus, she thought. Just put one foot in front of the other and try not to think about the fact that your internal temperature is skyrocketing while your external one is plummeting. At this rate, I'll explode by nightfall. Kira trudged her way through the snow, willing the feeling into her feet, even though they were starting to numb again. The last time they did, they had stopped in the crevice. Yet your gods cast you out. Not my gods. Only a few men and women who claim to represent them. Kira had no idea why the conversation she and Tyranitar had had in the Euphrates was coming back to her, but she tried to banish it from her head. Shut up! She cried. What? Torna asked from behind her. Nothing, Kira said, embarrassed. Great, now I'm yelling at the voices in my head. We will make it, Ashla. We must. There is no other way. If we do not, Perikia will be lost. It's our land. The Lerrit do not belong there, and I'll do everything I can to help them out. To keep them out. But we can't do it if we don't get Molochai's information back to the prefect. Kira looked back at Torna and saw the look of determination on his face, even through the snow and facial hair, through the bruises, and through the pain he felt. And she felt ashamed for doubting. We'll make it. One foot in front of the other, she thought. You can do it. We can do it. We'll make it back. Half an hour later, she collapsed face first into the snow. Chapter 8. Major? Sir? Tell me another story. While you had your weapons to protect you, all I had was my faith and my courage. Walk with the prophet's child. I know I will. I was there, sir. Bahala! It was the eve of the Peldor festival. I could hear them ringing the temple chimes. You were dreaming. No, I was there. I could smell the burning Bajoran leaves, taste the incense on the wind. I was standing in front of the obelisk, and as I looked up, for one moment, I understood it all. Bahala, the orbs, the occupation, the discovery of the wormhole, the coming war with the Dominion. A people can be defined by where they come from. Who the Bajorans are is shaped in part by our world. It's part of what ties us to the prophets. The Cardassians didn't belong there, so I fought them. All my life I fought for Bajor because that is my unit. You believe that caring for your home brings you closer to your gods. I suppose that's one way of looking at it. Yet your gods cast you out. Not my gods. Only a few men and women who claim to represent them. Why have you taken this woman's body? This vessel is willing. The reckoning. It is time. The reckoning. What is it? The end. Or the beginning. But what do the locusts represent? And why Cardassia? You were dreaming, and dreams don't always make sense. This was no dream! The captain is not going to die. He is the emissary. The prophets will take care of him. With all due respect, Major, I'd rather see Julian take care of him. Chief, I know you're worried, but the prophets are leading the emissary on this path for a reason. Do not attempt to convince them, Major. They cannot understand. Since when do you believe in the prophets? What I believe in is faith. Without it, there can be no victory. If the captain's faith is strong, he will prevail. It's not much to bet his life on. You're wrong. It's everything. Major? Sir? Tell me another story. Nerys? Kira's eyes fluttered awake. Where am I? You're back home. She didn't recognize the face. Who? Who are you? Where? You're in the infirmary. Julian? At Fort Tendro. No, Fort Tendro is on the outskirts of the peninsula. Practically the front lines. That's where Torna and I were headed. She looked up to see a pleasant round face partially obscured by a wispy white beard and equally wispy white hair. I'm Dr. Maldic, he said. How are you feeling? Thirsty and warm. Maldic smiled. That's good. Both very encouraging signs. Wait a minute, Kira cried out as Maldic started to walk away. What about Torna? We were in the mountains, and yes, you were in the mountains. Maldic turned back around. Almost died there, too, based on the shape you two were in when you got here. Pouncing on the words you two, Kira said. And also, General Torna, where is he? Tugging on his beard, Maldic said, he's already gone back to the capital. You and he had been declared dead by the Lerrit, you see. They claimed to have executed you. It therefore came as something of a surprise to see him stumbling into the fort, carrying you on his right shoulder. That bastard, Kira thought. After must have been annoyed that he didn't get his stadium receipt, so he decided to get some propaganda value out of pretending to kill us. Musing over her present condition, she thought, of course he came pretty close to calling it right that we were dead. In any case, he left immediately to pass on some news or other about the Lerrit, and also let his wife and children know that he was alive. Letting out a breath, Kira said, Lerrit must have been devastated. I wouldn't know. Oh, the general did ask me to pass on a message. He gave Maldic a questioning glance. The doctor tugged on his beard some more. He said, and I think I'm quoting this precisely, thank her for me. Snorting, Kira said, he's thanking me? What did I do besides fall on my face? Well, from what you said, you didn't actually come out and tell him you were dying of pneumonia while you were stupidly trudging through freezing mountains after wading hip-deep in a swamp. In a weak voice, Kira said, I didn't want to worry him. No! Another beard tug. Much better to wait until you fall unconscious and then completely frighten him. Yes, good point. Much better than simply worrying him. Kira ignored the barb, instead asking, what about his arm? Were you able to save it? Barely. You did a good job keeping the wound clean. If you'd continued your summer stroll for much longer, it would have been infected, but he got the two of you here in time. One last beard tug. Enough gossip. You need your rest. I'm fine, Kira said, and she started to sit up. The room proceeded to leap around, whirl in circles, and generally behave insanely until she lay back down, and then everything was fine. On the other hand, maybe rest isn't a bad idea. In a tone that sounded irritating like Julian at his most smug, Maldic said, soldiers make such wonderful patients. Try listening periodically. It'll do you wonders. To be concluded on Friday, when I will read chapters 9 through 12 of Horn and Ivory from What Lay Beyond, which can also be found in the Deep Space Nine Omnibus Twist of Faith. Either one of those will work. Check me out online at DeCandido.net, read my blog at DeCandido.wordpress.com, or support me at patreon.com/KRAD. There's lots of wonderful stuff there, and please, stay safe. I'll see you Friday.